So today we're going to take a look at someone else's data analysis for 2024, something I've had in my State of Indie research file, kind of only now really digging into it because there's a lot here. But before we get into this topic, I feel like maybe I haven't been very clear on my comment policy, or perhaps it's simply been too opaque and convoluted for some of you to follow. So I'm going to give it to the very refined version I've come up with. From now on, my comment policy is thus: don't be a dick. It's a very simple principle for those of you for whom the golden rule is just too damn difficult to follow. But all right, let's get into this. As always, the link is in the description if you want to read the whole thing, because we are just going to skim the surface on this. There's a lot here. So this is from a newsletter called OP Game Marketing, and it is the 2024 Indie and AA Games Market, what 5,000 plus games reveal about success and failure. So this is not the entire market. This person essentially excluded games that were at the absolute bottom. The restrictions were 2024 release, not AAA, and at least $500 in revenue. Now, that means that most games got nudged off. About 2/3 of them, actually, because $500 doesn't sound like much. It is well above the median for Steam in 2024, at least. And it's going to skew things a little bit because it means that the biggest failures didn't rate, but a lot of the biggest failures on Steam were games that were never going to succeed, so it's kind of okay. Just keep that in mind. We are avoiding the absolute losers here and just looking at games that met a certain threshold. So he's using Gamalytic for this primarily, which is the same data set I use. So he's using their definitions. He's actually going with publishers instead of developers. And you can see on screen the definitions that Gamalytic uses. And they're, again, trying to make this hobbyist term work. And I've mentioned before, I don't really like that. Whatever, they use it, so we're stuck with it. Also, a comment here from the person writing this: for the purposes of this article, the status of AA indie or hobbyist has less to do with studio size and more to do with experience. I think that's a decent... We've already had the big discussion about what the hell these terms even mean, and experience is one way of doing it. One of the problems with Gamalytic is that, especially for the publishers, they base this on income, which is, we're going to talk later about income, and the games classified as hobbyist, by definition, the top of the list are those that made a very specific amount of money that was very close to, but just under $10,000, which is why I think that's useless, but whatever. Again, I have issues with all of my data sources. We're all kind of working off of estimates here, whatever. So let's start by looking at revenue distribution. We can see, once again, heavy concentration. 83.92% of AA revenue went to the top 10% of games. 84.98% of indie revenue went to the top 10% of games in those categories. As I said, this is something we've seen across the video game space. There is just more and more attention being pulled onto a smaller and smaller number of games, although I think the dynamics are a little bit different in the indie space as opposed to AAA. AAA, it has more to do with the industry being taken over by these gigantic live service games and legacy series, stuff like Call of Duty. Down here in the indie trenches, it's more to do with just success eluding most people and kind of all of the success going on to a very small number of individuals, something that is true not just in video games, but really across the spectrum. Really, anywhere you look these days, you are seeing success concentrated more and more into a smaller and smaller number of hands. And it has to do with network effects and a lot of other things related to the internet and just what economics look like right now. That's just how it is. It's how video games work as well. He goes briefly into free-to-play, which is something I've never really talked about, so let me just give you what he has to say. Massive FTP live service titles have existed for years and are basically printing money, So I was curious how non-AAA F2B games are performing. The average revenue, and there aren't that many of them down here. He identified 167 out of, again, his data set was a little over 5,000. The average revenue is $1.7 million, but the median revenue is $26,000, which, granted, is still a lot better than games in this area overall. So that's not bad. Now, when we look at what the genres are, most of them are what you expect, but he identified several single player, including true single player games that are marked as free to play and yet still have revenue coming in. Some of them had single player tags, but were still focused on multiplayer PvP like Delta Force, Stormgate, and Enlisted. However, most of them were proper single player experiences. So, possible signs that smaller developers are getting into live service? Is that the stuff of our nightmares? Is that just what the future is going to look like? I don't know. Kind of too early to make that call. So this next one tracks onto something that I didn't touch upon in State of Indie last year, but I did 2 years ago, I believe. And that is the role that smaller publishers play in the indie process. Basically, does working with a publisher help you out? And here's his conclusion. I'm not going to lie, I love a good underdog story, so I was rooting for self-published games, but it's pretty clear from the data that games with a publisher performed better overall. Despite significantly more self-published games, games with a publisher had a higher total revenue, average revenue, and median revenue. Now, that's the exact same thing I found 2 years ago, and I'm going to have my little chart come up right now. You can see that games that had a publisher, especially a larger, more prestigious publisher, were a lot more likely to succeed. They were a lot more likely to make a significant amount of money. They tended to do better, have better scores overall, but there is, of course, an issue here, which is that it's a bit of a self-selecting group, because the self-published market includes everything, whereas the publishers are kind of picking through these to find the best possible games. So there's a causality issue. Yes, there is a definite connection between having a publisher and doing well, but is that because publishers bring these resources to bear and that is helping you reach a wider audience? Or is it because publishers are picking out the games that were most likely to succeed anyway? And that's exactly the same conclusion that he reaches down here. Publishers aren't picking games at random. They're investing in winners, games they believe will sell well and make them money. Meanwhile, self-published games are shipping whatever their creators manage to finish. So naturally, the publisher-backed games have a better track record. It's almost a statistical inevitability. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to test for this, to figure out which way the causality is running, because it's a counterfactual situation. We can't rerun the universe and re-release the same game with and without a publisher and see how well it does. So, and additionally, because the proportion of games with publishers, especially the bigger deal publishers, is pretty small overall, it's hard to do an apples-to-apples comparison as well. So the conclusion he reaches is it's ultimately a matter of your personal opinion if you think it's worth it to work with a publisher to reach a larger audience. Maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't. It's kind of a wait-and-see type of thing, and hopefully it'll work out for the best. But the people he's talked to that work with the better publishers, and again, it matters a lot who you're working to. There are some shitty publishers these days. If you work with a decent one, it does seem to help things, at least a little bit. Now we're going to look at some tags. Steam tags, of course, are kind of funny because it's a mix of genres and subgenres and features and a lot of other descriptors. He's calling them all genres. Of course, most of these aren't. But there's a lot of stuff in here about Steam tags. I'm just going to look at a few of these topics. One of them is niche genres, what he's calling emerging niche genres, that were used in 10% of games or less, but also appeared in the top 50 revenue genres. So these are tags that are not used by many people, but are showing up in games that make a lot of money. And there aren't too many surprises in here. This is kind of what I was expecting to see. Right at the left, you can see, of course, some co-op stuff. Again, co-op's been a really big deal. We see open world and survival games still doing very well, not too big a surprise there. Immersive sims, which again have been having a real moment lately, those are doing really well. Dungeon crawlers are kind of starting to claw their way back out of the cellars of history, and those have been doing well recently. So, not a lot here that's terribly shocking. These I likely smaller tags just because these are games that are a little bit harder to develop, so fewer people are doing them. Next, we've got tags for the highest and lowest median revenue. And this first one, this first one is enlightening because okay, the category here is the tag that has the highest median revenue and was used in at least 10% of games. The most profitable, on average, tag by a decent margin, NSFW. Number 2 is sexual content, followed by nudity. And if you look through kind of the top 10, you're going to notice some themes here. Now, okay, the H game thing is something we don't talk a lot about in indie, even though it's a huge deal down here. It's a huge deal down here. And, you know, depending on what your Steam settings are, you may never see these games, or you may only see some of them, or you may only hear about them. There's a lot of them on Steam, though. And the thing about these sexually explicit games, these porno games, is they're easy to make with a small team. Most of them are basically some variant on a visual novel. And there's an audience for them. There's a sizable audience for these types of games. I do believe we had an article a couple years back on Super Jump about this kind of game because we never like to talk about them. You know, we're all a little bit ashamed that these even exist, but they're part of it, and they're a big part of it. And that's just a fact. It's just a fact. You don't have to like it. You know, I used to publish stuff on KDP, and I didn't make any money at it, and I was being subsidized by Bigfoot erotica. I mean, that's just something I had to acknowledge was the fact. You know, a lot of the dirtier stuff is the reason why the rest of us can do this for free or cheap. That's just how it is. Turning that around, we have common tags that have the lowest median revenue. And what's down at the bottom? Arcade, puzzle, and eventually casual and horror. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean these are failures. A lot of these are actually high revenue overall, made a lot of money, but they're highly competitive. And that's what I want to pick out with the fact that horror and several horror-related ones show up in here. When you see videos from people doing the best genres for indie developers, they always throw in horror, and it's just because they can think of 3 games that achieved meme status and made a lot of money. And they employ there's a lot of survivorship bias. They imply some ex post facto reasoning to explain why that is. And what they neglect to note is that horror is an incredibly common tag. An incredibly common tag on Steam. There are so many horror games, and the vast majority of them go nowhere. The fact that there have been a few successes doesn't really mean anything. This is a very, very difficult genre to break into because everybody else is doing it. Everybody is doing it. The field is really crowded. There's only room for a few of these games to become memes, and the rest of them just don't do that well. It's the reason why I bumped horror down when I did the last tier list, is I think it's way overvalued because it's just a much, much, much harder genre than people seem to think. Not impossible, but very, very difficult, and your odds of success working in that are extremely low. Overall, there wasn't a lot here that was massively different than what I found in SOI. Kind of tracks with what I thought. Industry's tough. It's very, very difficult right now. Disregard all the rah-rah stuff. Most people are not doing that well. If someone moves a couple hundred or a couple thousand copies and makes a small profit, then good for them. They're succeeding where most others have failed. Obviously, we hope things are going to get better in the future. Maybe it will. Maybe there'll be more. Maybe VC will come back into this, or maybe there'll be more funds, or maybe AAA will combust again. This is a year where the AAA sector is likely to be pretty strong. new hardware coming up that is definitely going to keep down interest in indies for a while. So it's probably not going to be a great year, maybe not a great 2 years, but we'll see how it all shakes out after that.